Welcome to Redesigning the Dharma. I'm your host, Adrian Baker. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Ian Baker. Ian is a scholar of Vajrayana Buddhism, a yogi, an explorer, and an author with more than 40 years' experience studying and teaching Tibetan Buddhism. Ian is the author of 7 critically acclaimed books on Himalayan and Tibetan cultural history, environment, art, and medicine, including The Heart of the World, A Journey to the Last Secret Place, The Tibetan Art of Healing, and the Dalai Lama's Last Secret Temple, a collaborative work with His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, that illuminates tantric Buddhist meditation practices. Ian has also written for National Geographic magazine and has contributed to academic journals in the field of Tibetan yoga and Vajrayana Buddhism. And now much of Ian's work is leading pilgrimages to sacred sites in India, Tibet, Bhutan, places in Europe, including Greece, along with another excellent teacher, Dr. Nita, and their organization is called the Vajra Path, which I encourage everyone to check out. And as always, please, if you have any questions, comments, feedback, things you'd like to see more of, please follow up and reach out either in the comments section on YouTube or Instagram, as well as just reaching out directly through email, sahajasoma@pm.me. And now for my conversation with Dr. Ian Baker. Ian, thank you so much. It's wonderful to have you back on Redesigning the Dharma. It's always an adventure, a pilgrimage speaking with you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here always. And I think we're always in a world where we need to reevaluate where we've come from and where we're going. So redesigning the Dharma is, if that's the natural path, then we have to make sure that we're aligned with it in every way. So I appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you. So our conversation is going to be pilgrimage, which I've talked about with some other recent guests, such as Miles Neal and Tiffany Gyatso. And we talked about it in our first conversation a bit together, but I really want to dive deeper into it in this conversation with you. And to kick things off, I'd like you to share just a little bit about the essence of your background that got you into pilgrimage. For people who really want to do a deep dive, they can go back to that first conversation. But I think so much of the time in Dharma communities, we're used to thinking of practice as meditation and lots of meditation retreats. And after going through a period where sort of you were intensively practicing with your own guru, you sort of realize that pilgrimage is kind of your practice and your life path. And I'm wondering if you could give people a brief introduction to that in terms of how this...
Well, I think it ties into that earlier conversation that we had about pilgrimage and about spiritual practice. And so when I was 18, I was in college in America, but there was this opportunity to travel to Kathmandu, Nepal for a college semester abroad program. And in a certain sense, it was a pilgrimage for me. I'd never been to Asia. I'd never been that far away from familiar terrain. And so at that time, one of my great passions was rock climbing and mountaineering. And so the lure of the Himalayas was a large part of what drew me onto a program that nonetheless exposed me to so many things that were completely new in my life. One of those, of course, being esoteric, tantric Tibetan Buddhism, which was, had a lot of juice to it, a lot of power, the art. I mean, so much of what I was exposed to on the very first day of arriving in Kathmandu in 1977 was like, I said, wow, this is a place where I wanted to dive as deeply as I could. And so I was very fortunate within the first couple of weeks of being in Nepal to be introduced to who became my teacher, Chato Rinpoche. Actually first introduced to Dujam Jigdro Yeshe Dorje Rinpoche, the head of the Nyingma lineage, who was quite old at that time and only lived for a few more years. But then right after that, the same person said, now you have to meet Chato Rinpoche. And that was a real turning point in my life at that time. My inspiration to go to Nepal, apart from the college semester abroad program, that was also, for me, I was an art major at the time. It was based on learning the fundamentals of Tibetan Buddhist art. But meeting Chato Rinpoche changed everything. Just his presence, his energy, I think, as I might have mentioned before, it was like meeting Merlin. It was like meeting somebody, really a wizard. And I'd had exposure to Zen Buddhism before. And then in that conversation, there were only 2 of us there besides me and Chato Rinpoche. Then the whole question came up about Zen, which, of course, since we're talking about spiritual practice, is the kind of the archetype of still meditation and remaining in kind of an incubational state in which the mind somehow moves beyond its customary parameters, and that breakthrough, the Kensho, and ultimately Satori, the awakening experience, arises from that. So in that first conversation, because I'd had that background and done Zen retreats and had very profound experiences with it, Chato Rinpoche spoke about Zen. There's like, and he took an egg He said, it's perfect in itself, but it doesn't have handles. And he put it on the little table in between us, and he said it rolls around. So Tantra, Vajrayana, in this sense, is what stabilizes that realization that can arise through the pure meditative experience, which is Zen, which of course is just the Japanese pronunciation of Dhyan. So it just meant this pure meditation was recognized as the method that had brought the Buddha to his own awakening experience. But what was particularly exciting for me in that context, because I wanted to experience this tradition in the context of the nature, in a sense, of the Himalayas that had, in a way, inspired these traditions. And so one of the first things when I'd heard about this Tibetan tradition of hidden lands, Bayu, where the ripening of the mind in such places would be achieved at a much more accelerated level. And even according to the text, where one day of meditation was worth a year somewhere else. I mean, all kinds of exaggerated claims. But the idea was that these were powerful, potent places that if one connected with them in a spirit of Buddhist contemplation, then one would have very fast results. So when I asked Chatra Rinpoche, because I was 19 at the time, so I was very ready and ripe to go in deep into the mountains about the hidden lands, the Bayu, he just looked at me and he said, "Can you spend a month alone?" And I had said, yeah, if there was a reason for that, of course. Then he said, okay, you come back when you have a month free. I'll send you to a hidden land, and then you won't have to ask me what their qualities are. You'll know directly from experience. So that was an incredible challenge to have been given and a wonderful opportunity. And so I went back, and to make a long story short, because I chronicled it in my book, The Heart of the World, originally called Journey to the Last Secret Place, but ultimately Journey to Tibet's Lost Paradise, focusing on this tradition of Bayu and how they served as supports for spiritual practice and realization. But in the case with Chatra Rinpoche, it was a direct first-hand experience of traveling. He sent me to one of these places. He'd come back in a month, and so I did my practices. Many kinds of experiences are what are called in Tibetan tradition Nyam, kind of meditative experiences arose, and then discussed those with him, and then that became the basis for my ongoing apprenticeship, if you want to call it that, with Chatra Rinpoche. He taught according to a tradition called Nyamchi, which means according to experiences, and then his commentaries or his instructions based upon one's own personal experience, as opposed to following a kind of set by more monastic curriculum. So that's what made my relationship with him, for me, very special. And in all cases with him, it was always pushing me further to go other hidden lands. He wrote them all out in beautiful calligraphy. Now go to these places, stay. So it was always about how does the power place, or being called Ne in Tibetan, or the hidden land, serve to accelerate spiritual practice. And he always encouraged me to go beyond what I might have been accustomed to, might feel comfortable with, and all of that. And I think he was amused by my readiness to go. The harder it was, the more excited I got. And of course, that was prompted by my earlier background in mountaineering and rock climbing, where one seeks out wild, dangerous, vertiginous terrain in order to confront the mind and move beyond one's current limits and limitations. So that's why the high mountain ideal of practice and pilgrimage was very natural for me, given the background I'd had in my even younger years as a teenager with the encounters with high mountain environments. So that's what brought me to Nepal. It's what brought me into the whole world of Tibetan Buddhism, and an ongoing relationship over decades with Chatra Rinpoche, where it was always about encouraging me to go into these wild places, to meditate there for whatever periods of time. Often it was a month. They'd just say stay, sometimes shorter, then come back, tell them my experience, and then he'd send me off to some other place. So it was about what we see in the Tibetan tradition about integrating stillness and movement. So sometimes in Dzogchen, for example, movement refers to the movement of thoughts, and stillness is the thought-free, pristine awareness that is, in a way, the source from which thoughts may arise. But rather than seeing them as being in any way in conflict, it's about merging and integrating stillness and movement, so that this is a fertile ground of awakening, as opposed to seen as a conflict between awakening and mundane life, in which thoughts are sometimes considered by some to be inhibitory or distracting. But from a Dzogchen point of view, they're just integrated, and therefore there is no ground for distraction.
There are opportunities for recognition as well.
Absolutely.
Tupul Urgurd Rinpoche's got some really lovely quotes along those lines.
And that's the beauty of it. It's all, the practice is about recognizing an already existing state, as about trying to cultivate cultivate it in some kind of way. And this sometimes can be for some conflict. We have to cultivate these states. Well, on one level, yes, but on another level, they're naturally there, but we do have to sometimes clear the ground, polish the mirror, to use the Zen analogy. What brought me into the whole world of Tibetan Buddhism as a teenager, essentially, and to a long-standing relationship with my teacher, Chatrul Rinpoche, who was very connected to these power places, to Ne and Bayu, and the power that such places had in being able to support and in some ways even initiate certain kinds of experiences that might have been harder to have if you were just stuck in the city. And so it really gave me an inspiration always to go deeper into nature, deeper into these whole complex of sacred places. And that meant not just the hidden lands and Nes of the Himalayas, but it also meant power places in India, which Chatrul Rinpoche was also very connected with and interested in. So, yeah, and it remains for me a continuing journey, because I recognize every time that I move out of my settled environment and challenge my system on all levels to embrace the unknown and embrace the wild, that we develop a kind of inner resilience and insight and capacities that sometimes remain somewhat dormant if we just kind of keep to a more comfortable level of practice. We might cultivate stillness, we might cultivate a sort of calm abiding, but as we know in the Tibetan and Dzogchen tradition, as Tsoknyi Rinpoche and Mingyur Rinpoche both point out, for example, as their father Tugurigin pointed out, that kind of shamatha, that state of just kind of settled stillness, can itself be one of the great sand traps, as it were, on the Dharma field. And it's more about that vibrant, ever-present awareness that comes sometimes by challenging ourselves rather than actually retreating into more comfortable and what might be considered in some respects a safer space. But as we know in Tantra, safety wasn't the point.
That's right.
It was like Helen Keller said, safety.
What did she say? She's got some great quotes.
She's got some great quotes.
She was a mystical woman.
Yeah, she was really.
Yeah.
She said, "Security does not exist in nature." So something interesting like that. Yeah, and so it was not. It was about moving beyond that, and we see that in Shakespeare's Macbeth, for example, when Macbeth goes to Hecate, and where she says something similar. She says when he consults the Queen of the Witches, where he's looking for some kind of coordinates in which to moor his life after basically murdering the King of Scotland, and she said, "Security is mortal's chiefest enemy." So it's a kind of koanic statement, but what I think is implied by that, as soon as we kind of become into a kind of complacency of any kind, then we've lost that friction with life and reality that prevents a kind of more vital and sometimes volatile growth process.
I'm going to seize on that word friction
please.
for a moment, because so much of modern life and technology, and I mean, for example, I'm into health and biohacking, so much of that is about making things frictionless. That's kind of the term out of Silicon Valley a lot. That's the idea behind the design of apps and optimization and so many different things. But while efficiency is certainly a wonderful value, a lot of the growth in life, for example, like in relationships, does indeed come through friction. And I've seen that in my own experience. It's wonderful to sort of optimize things and get into a routine, but then there's that balance between it's good to be grounded, it's good to have all the orderliness that a routine can bring, but then also at a certain point it can turn into complacency. It can sort of sap some of that dynamism and vitality from life. It can sap that spontaneity as well.
No, I think very much. As you say, in the biohacking world, everything is about trying to optimize everything that we do. And yet sometimes that process, as we know in sports, in physical culture, we need to push beyond our comfort zone. I mean, that's what happens in the gym. We actually push the body, we push the muscles, and then they need to rest, recuperate, and then they grow. But that would never happen unless we pushed it to the limit, as it were, pushing the boundaries of our own physiological, respiratorial limits. And by pushing the limits, holding our breath out, all of these things are having a reciprocal process simply in the nervous system, where we work with the sympathetic nervous system in order to have the corresponding parasympathetic release and regenerative. But it doesn't really happen effectively unless we really worked with it on a more dynamic level first. So I think all of that is so much related to the idea really of pilgrimage, which, as we see from those early mountain pilgrimages, which were always about pushing beyond the limit in the village, whatever was pushing beyond the limit, even one's own physical capacity, as there were ancient pilgrimages, and also in Ireland about climbing barefoot up rocky mountains. And it was about, in a way, a cultivated discomfort, which really goes to the very meaning of pilgrimage itself. It wasn't always connected with the idea of travel to sacred places. Pilgrim was somebody who was foreign, somebody who was outside. It was about going beyond the familiar terrain in order for something to change, to evolve. And I think that's an important thing to recognize, that in pilgrimage, it's about entering into a kind of liminal space betwixt and between. And we look at that in anthropological senses of what pilgrimage was really about, what Van Genner referred to as the rite of passage, where we actually remove ourselves from the familiar tribal world and we actually confront the unknown. And by confronting that, we develop resiliences and capacities that are only possible when you kind of move beyond the familiar and the comfortable, and then come back. And that leads to a higher integration, both in terms of the individual making the journey, but it also is, to use Miles Niels' term that you said you had your conversation with him, you're returning with the elixir. You're returning with something that has a potency and benefit, not just for yourself, but for the community itself. It's the hero's journey in Joseph Campbell's sense. We make these necessary journeys that always involve hardship and challenge of every kind, but by embracing those challenges, something breaks through in a very positive and transformative way.
Perhaps this would be a good time to, as we're starting to go deeper into pilgrimage, to give people the frame of outer, inner, and secret pilgrimage, so that we might talk about that, what it means to return with that elixir and to go on the pilgrimage, because it can be working on a few different levels.
Yeah. So, in my experience with pilgrimage, which was really, you could say initially in the Himalayan world, in the Tibetan Buddhist world, and the word that's used in Tibetan for pilgrimage is nekor. So ne means a power place. It's a place in nature that has a particular potency, and that's either an innate potency by virtue of the elements that are there coming into some kind of natural resonance that makes practice in such a place, or just even being in such a place, transformative. And it also has, by tradition, associated with great masters and siddhas, and like Padmasambhava or Yeshe Tsogyal, who may have practiced in such places and imbued them with the potency of their own spiritual capacities. And so we have throughout the Himalayan world, for example, when we talk about outer pilgrimage, it's often to places that, let's say, Padmasambhava, Yeshe Tsogyal, who are really at the foundations of Tibetan Tantric Buddhism, places that they practiced, which are invariably wild nature, cliffside caves, mountaintops, and whether it's in Bhutan, Nepal, Tibet, they're powerful places. And by going to them is the idea that you connect to the lineage and to everything that is represented by those kind of literally ancestral figures in the tradition. So, of course, the classic example might be Tiger's Nest in Bhutan, which is a place where Padmasambhava, Yeshe Tsogyal, as well as Tash Chidren, his Bhutanese consort, all practiced and imbued the cliffs, the waterfalls, the caves in that place with a power and a potency that the contemporary temple built around that, of course, enshrines it. And we have it in the form of their statues and paintings and all of that. But it's actually the cave that underlies it all, where everything in a way happened. And so the pilgrimage is about going to such a place. And even in its more contemporary iteration as a monastic setting, it's the power of the place that underlies it that is the outer pilgrimage. And so that may extend, for example, in India, we have the 24 sacred places that are also described in the Buddhist Tantras, connected to, on an outer level, with places where Vajrayana Buddhism had evolved. We have that in the Chakrasamvara Tantra, for example, the Hevajra Tantra. And in the hidden land tradition that I was particularly engaged with, the outer hidden land, the Beul, can be identified geographically. So, for example, Pemaku, the one where I went repeatedly, in the far northeast corner of the Himalayas, where the great Brahmaputra River comes down in this great gorge from Tibet down into the Assamese plains ultimately, but in the jungles, ravines, all of that very, very difficult terrain to reach, was the kind of geographical idea of the hidden land of Pemaku, the hidden land of the lotus, or the display of lotuses. So in an inner level, it's actually goes from the geographical to the anatomical, and the lotus land, if we will, of Padmasambhava suddenly is referring to the lotus chakra system within our own energetic anatomy. So the inner hidden land, this place that's so, lauded on an outer level as an ultimate sanctuary in the end times, is no longer being referred to geographically, but it's being referred to as a place, as a space that we can discover within our own embodied being, emerging through the practices of yoga and meditation. So that's kind of the inner hidden land. And the outer elements that we see in the hidden land are also, earth, water, fire, air, have their anatomical correspondences and the flesh, bones, blood, and metabolic heat and breath of the body. So it's working with that non-dual relationship between the outer and inner elements. And then the secret hidden land, or the secret idea of pilgrimage, is where, as Chatur Rinpoche described it, where those two factors come together, where you're in that non-dual space between the outer and the inner, are no longer in some kind of dynamic dialogue, but actually are recognized as just this ever-present dynamic polarity that at the same time is a non-dual polarity. It's almost a paradoxical reality, but it's actually the way we experience reality. We can understand the non-dual state, but only in the context of having, on one relative level, a dualistic relationship, which is a dynamic one. That's the whole Shiva Shakti. It's the whole idea of consciousness and nature. So the secret pilgrimage is one that is happening no longer solely on a geographical level, no longer solely, within our own esoteric physiology of the chakra nadi system within our bodies, but it's where we recognize that these are in dynamic relationship always. And so, for example, one place that for me is very powerful in Bhutan that I always try to include in pilgrimages that I lead in Bhutan is the Chumpu Ne. It's a valley connected to the body of Vajrayogini. So Vajrayogini, who is she, Vajravarahi, she is the goddess of inner fire. So her outer iconography is surrounded by an aureole of fire, but she is fire herself. And what does fire mean in this context? Is it's a transformative energy that is burning up our karmic self in order to reveal our enlightened self. So people often ask, why do we need these anthropomorphic expressions of enlightened mind in Vajrayana? Isn't that just distracting us from the fact that we are the deity ultimately? And it's true, as Trungpa Rinpoche famously said when he found people were getting too attached to the deity practice. He said, when you are a deity yourself, two-armed, why do you need to imagine one with six arms? But I think he was responding more to people who were becoming very literalistic about the practices, and that is certainly recognized as a stumbling block, as it can be. But when it's understood in a more dynamic way, it's a form that I sometimes think of as, it's like method acting. When you become the deity, it's a provisional way in which we expand our imaginative processes in order to re-envision ourselves as something other than we conventionally would see ourselves as being. So we see that in acting classes, you take on the persona of a particular, whether it's a hitman, whether it's a benevolent philanthropist,
Sure.
whatever it might be. It's an imaginative exercise where we work with the creative visualization in order to become that which we normally don't imagine ourselves to be, and yet it has a transformative effect. So in any case, because everything in Tibetan Buddhism is modeled on this outer, inner, secret, and then innermost secret or yangsang level, in the context of the hidden lands, you have the geographical, you could say the physiological or psychophysiological, then you have the integration, the total integration of body-mind, if you want to call it that, at the secret level, where there's no separation between the outer elements in nature and the inner elements as they are experienced in one's body, mind, and a lot of visionary experiences result from that. And then the innermost, the yangsang, or the innermost secret level, is really the awakened state, in which the non-dual nature of form and emptiness and appearance and emptiness, everything is experientially present within one's experience. And then the Bayu, the hidden land, is everywhere. And we see that even in the language of Zen, for example, the idea of the lotus land. The idea is that when awakening occurs, then you realize the lotus land is everywhere. It's not like you have to go anywhere to find it. It's like Shambhala, the same idea. It's not external to our innate nature. It's actually just an expression of it, whether it's geographical expression or physiological expression.
But that's an interesting part of the paradox to hold, because on the one hand, especially in Buddhism, it's cultivating this equanimity where nirvana is everywhere. It's a shift in perception, and it's a sense of basic okayness wherever you are. And yet there are great teachers and great masters who still feel that call to go to sacred sites. So while on an absolute level, the former might be true, on a relative level, there is something to the fact that there are particular sites that have a particular power to them. And that's why great teachers, great practitioners continue to go to them. Yeah. And something that you pointed out at the beginning when we were preparing for this is there's something deeply archetypal just in our nature about being nomadic. Human beings have been nomadic from the beginning of time. If we're talking about even India, the genesis of that great civilization is a marriage between the nomadic peoples, Aryans, and what they brought down, and then the Dravidian people who were already there, and the mixing of those two cultures. And so there's something in our nature that is drawn to exploration for a number of reasons. traditions, as well as that desire to root into ground. And of course, each of us individually might gravitate towards one or the other, but there's real value in pushing beyond our comfort zones. I like that term you use, cultivated. What was it? Cultivated discomfort, something along those lines?
Yeah, something like cultivated discomfort, because the
Yeah.
idea is to enter into that liminal space, which is often described in anthropological terms as betwixt and between. You're not here, you're not there, you're in the state of liminality in which everything is possible and yet nothing is limited. It is, in Tibetan Buddhist terms, kind of the bardo of our everyday lives, in which it's a state of ever-present possibility. But if we seek to grasp at it, then it can become something that just feels ungrounded, but it actually is the natural state of being. And we experience it in nomadic cultures. It was about moving into unfamiliar terrain, and actually the excitement, I imagine, that would have occurred. You reach the next horizon and you have no idea, no one's ever gone there before, and then the new vistas open, herds of buffalo, herds of wild dells, whatever it might have been in that early Paleolithic period, when it was clearly not just people finding the right cave they wanted to settle in, but it was about movement. It's why they crossed the Bering Sea. It's why they built boats to travel down from Indonesia into Australia. There was always a sense of going beyond into the next, crossing boundaries and exploring. And I think that sense of exploration, which is also a state of expansion, is so intrinsic to our nature. And often people lament today, oh, there's nothing new under the sun. There's no place we can go now that's unknown. Everything can be found through Google Earth, whatever it is. But the point is that it's an experiential rather than strictly geographical. So even going to places that just may be new for us, or to experience the familiar in a new way, which is really often the key, is something where we do push beyond the boundaries, the curtains of complacency, in a way that often obscure that larger sense of the world. And that's where I think pilgrimage as a model, even today, is so relevant in a time when so many people define themselves as digital nomads, where we have the freedom in order to work anywhere, often, as long as we have Wi-Fi connection. But that is also just an extension of the interconnectivity, which is life itself. So the Wi-Fi, in a certain sense, is not anything other than just the pure dimension of interconnectivity that affects all of the laws of nature from gravity onward. But we're just tapping into it in practical terms. But it also means that, again, we have the opportunity to be seasonal nomads, and we may want to be up in northern Scandinavia in the summer, but not in the winter. And we may want to be in the tropics in the winter and not in the summer. Working with the rhythms of nature to see where we can best align when we have that freedom to not be rooted in one place. And even when we are, we can see spiritual traditions that, in a way, enshrine the idea of moving beyond the comfort. Like in the Zen monastic tradition, there was a tradition called monk jumps over the wall, where often the abbot, the roshi, would tell monks suddenly, and they became so entrenched within their zazen sitting practice, and he would throw them, basically, go, come back in a month. And sometimes without any kind of direction or guidance, they would just suddenly find themselves out in the world. And the idea was to explore it, delve into it fully, whatever it might entail, and then come back to the monastery. But it was after a refreshment, a reset. Sometimes it was just a confirmation that the outside world didn't really have anything that one needed, but one would experience that firsthand and therefore be even more ready to submit, if we want to call it that, to monastic discipline, which in a sense was its own crucible of awakening. But I think a very skillful way of engaging with the world. And I think we also see that same process in the Tibetan Buddhist world too. Many who stayed for long periods, both in monastic retreat or meditation or even in cave retreats, would often get these messages. Often it was described in archetypal forms as, a dakini, sky maiden, whispering in their ear that it was time to make a journey somewhere in order to advance their practice. Research I've been doing now on the whole Dujun Lingpa tradition, that's happening a lot.
Fascinating.
A lot of the practices where there suddenly, as it were, you get a whisper in your ear, however we want to define that in the cultural terms, that they had to go to Mount Kailash or they had to go to somewhere where their practice would be advanced. And a lot of that just simply meant getting out of the comfort zone that one had established for oneself and suddenly confronting the unknown. And there's a wonderful term in the Tibetan language, kasher lamkir, means whatever happens, you bring it to the path. And this an aphorism for pilgrimage. In other words, when you enter into into pilgrimage, it's not like you have to try to make anything happen in a particular way. It's whatever arises, whatever challenges, whatever difficulties, you just integrate. You integrate it and don't resist it. So it's about, as we also see in the Zen tradition, not falling into preferential consciousness, if we can call it that. This idea of like and dislike and all of that can become the famous Zazen Wasen, the Sahaja Zazen, to talk about that. That's what divides heaven and earth, is when we fall into preferential thinking, where this is good, this is bad, this we want, this we don't want. All of that is to divide reality into an unnatural polarity, as opposed to experiencing it as totality.
How do you think about that distinction? Because, of course, on a relative level, you have preferences, like you're preferring to lead trips to certain places,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So someone might ask you, and don't you have a preference for Bhutan because you keep going back there, or someone like that? So how would you reconcile or
Yeah, I
make
think
that
that's a very,
distinction?
very good question to ask, because I think on an ultimate level, a lot of that is referring, let's say, in the Zen tradition, to actually meditative practice, where a lot of makyo, a lot of things can arise in practice, and we fall into acceptance and rejection, this kind of polarized mindset, which can actually prevent that kind of breakthrough into the non-dual state that we otherwise would be seeking. And so it also is an existential stance in which we might get caught in traffic jams and be irritated by it. But it's about, in a certain sense, embracing whatever arises without trying to wish it was otherwise, because often that's what we spend our whole life doing, saying, oh, if it was this way, I'd be happy. If it was this way, everything would be better. So I think a lot of it is on that level. But at the same time, none of that actually in any way is contrary to the very fact that we have natural affinities in life. So we prefer certain colors, we prefer certain settings. Relationships are all based upon laws of natural attraction, that where we have preferences, we wouldn't be happy being necessarily with somebody who we weren't attracted to.
Sure.
So when we have natural affinities, natural attractions, we have innate preferences. And I think a lot of those are ones that are obviously positive, in the sense that they are our karmic affinities that in a way resonate with our own personal processes. So I don't think it's in any way contradictory, but I really do think this idea of not separating, of not falling into like and dislike, is more of a subtle, almost a mystical proposition in that famous Zazen formulation of splitting heaven and earth apart by thinking that they're somehow separate. And we can see in really mystical traditions how heaven and earth, if we want to take that as the idea of samsara nirvana, you can look at William Blake, the great poet. He talks about the marriage of heaven and hell, and actually how you have to bring the two together, because one without the other is sort of anemic angels who need that kind of the blood and the power and the duende, as it were, of the lower realms. So that's where I think it's a kind of very vivifying idea of joining heaven and hell, not in terms of good and evil, but in terms of energy. That's what he writes in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Everything that has energy issues from hell. So he's talking about Shiva and Shakti, pure awareness, consciousness, and the energy that animates that consciousness. That is Shiva Shakti. But he writes about it in more poetic terms, like Lorca did the same with the theory and play of the duende. The duende is everything that has black sounds. In an essay he wrote on that, he was asked, how does he define it? And he says it's like birds sweeping the ground with wings of rusty knives. It's sort of a jarring idea that's both exciting and kind of tingling, scary, but also animating. And I think this is where he writes about the duende, which had its most famous cultural expression in bullfights. Not that one wants to encourage anything remotely like that, but it was, again, something where there was awe, dread, and wonder and power, because you're dancing on that edge of life and death. And I think that's where sometimes we find, and that's even in pilgrimage, the more dangerous it is. We've had an incredible transformative journey if we've survived it, but there's often
A shadow there.
There's a shadow where, adventure, the greater the adventure, the closer one's come, in a certain sense, to death sometimes. And that is, we see that in the hero's journey. We see that in all of these transformative journeys that we talk about. And of course, ultimately, that's referring in the context of these pilgrimage narratives to a kind of ego death. Now, we have to go beyond what we thought we were in order to come into our greater transpersonal being that the pilgrimage invites us to do. And of course, the ego is the ultimate expression of likes and dislikes and preferences experiences, and
Yes.
I want this, I want that. But there's sort of a proposition to make to oneself, just accept whatever happens and then integrate it, and it will all kind of make sense in the end. And we know that from pushing ourselves sometimes into dimensions that we aren't necessarily comfortable with at first. But it's complicated in today's world.
It is indeed. I love watching documentaries on big wave surfers, and that is very much part of that shadow there and finding that edge. I wanted to ask you about some of these places you have affinities for at the moment, sort of what is really speaking to you in terms of your interests at this period in time. I know last time you were on the podcast, we were talking about your interest in the Silk Roads and the connection between Buddhism and the Silk Roads.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's when you were just starting to get more into it, leading more trips in
Yep.
Greece. You've now led one in Turkey. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit big picture about what's animating you in terms of where you're wanting to lead pilgrimage. Give us the overview, and then perhaps we can get
Sure.
into individual trips to
Mhm.
give people a sense of also how these trips can vary.
Yeah, well, for me, in this idea of pilgrimage and the Silk Roads, for example, I mean, the Silk Roads is such an iconic idea of the trade routes that connected ancient Cathay, which China was called before, the Far East with the Mediterranean world. And we know that all these iconic trade centers, the Bukhara, Samarkand, Tashkent, all these places that developed in Central Asia along these caravan routes were places for trade, not just in goods and materials, which of course they were, whether it was silk, whether it was musk, whether it was spices, and all kinds of things were traded along the routes. But there was also a lot of movement of religions along those same routes. So there were often pilgrims and traders who'd be part of the same caravans. And those were also very interesting in some of those early accounts of the caravanserai, which were really like travelers' hostels of the time, but very interesting. Like you see in Chaucer's tales, where pilgrims came together, there was often very fertile conversation and exchange of ideas and expansion of perspectives. And so I've been fascinated by the idea of the caravanserais, which were these ancient places where pilgrims, traders, adventurers of all kinds would come together necessarily, and then often travel together on the next sector of the Great Silk Roads, which were otherwise dangerous because there were often bandits and other very specific dangers along the way. So that's always fascinated me, this link, and also the ideas that traveled along, like even when Alexander the Great, for example, traveled from the Hellenic world all the way to northwest frontiers of India. It was a pilgrimage for him as well. He was trying to connect to, where did Dionysus, where did this incredible, powerful, archetypal Greek god that he identified with originate? And of course, some of the stories is that he originated in that Nesa, a place that was now identified in the Swat Valley in what's now Pakistan. We know from Alexander's journey, he would go way out of his way to visit some of these sacred shrines and sacred places, and the teachers and the yogis, the gymnosophists in India, for example, the naked philosophers, and also Piro, who was from the same period, connecting with Buddhism and bringing, in a way, Buddhist thought back to Greece in the form of Piroism, which had a very similar kind of analytical approach that early Buddhism had. So I'm fascinated by how these ideas circulate. So I'm very fortunate this last fall to be able to travel through 5 of the so-called stans, from Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, basically following core central section of the Silk Roads. And it was an amazingly exciting opportunity to see, first of all, incredible, powerful mountains, which are always very resonant for me, the Tian Shan, the Pamirs, and just how these corridors were opened for camels or whatever other means of transportation there were at the time in these incredibly potent places where there were very rich nomadic traditions and cultures. And so traveling through those areas and seeing the way that these different religious traditions had interacted, like Zoroastrianism and its traditions of the fire worship and the traditions of the homa consumption, all the way along the clear trade that existed between India, let's say, and parts of Turkmenistan, for example. There was clear evidence of ancient ritual ingestion of potent psychoactive substances that were integrated within a literally pagan cultural context, because they actually already adopted some of the Hellenic deities in that context. So to me, that exchange and integration of different traditions, how it actually expressed itself in art, architecture, was very exciting and vivifying. And to learn learned that places like Bukhara, which now, of course, is all Islamic, in name only, because these stans were under Soviet rule for a long period. So the kind of Islam that we see is actually extremely moderate. And it was also areas where Sufism was very rich, which, of course, already was to some degree a breaking away from the fundamentalism that otherwise did come to define some aspects of Islam. But Bukhara, for example, is seen to be a derivation of the Buddhist vihara. It was a Buddhist monastic complex and then gradually became a trade center. And so we see some of these places there that have become basically bazaars, trade bazaars, were actually monastic complexes in the past. And there was a lot of evidence we saw along the way, for example, of Buddhism's movements along these routes, their interaction with Sufi traditions, yogic traditions of one kind and another. So to me, that's this cross-fertilization of ideas, of practices, as we're all looking to where you started out the conversation, we're all looking for not just the biohacking, but we're looking at trying to look at what is it that lies at the roots of culture and religion that really has a transformative effect that we can feel viscerally and profoundly psychologically and therefore spiritually. But in a certain sense, it's all about finding that natural affinity with the practices, the places, the art, the substances sometimes that are connected with
the food
all of that.
for many of us.
Yeah, in that sense, so my affinity is the idea of the Silk Road connecting Mongolia to the Mediterranean. And so on both ends of the Silk Road, I've done trips from Ephesus to Cappadocia, looking at the far western end of the Silk Road. And then this summer, we have a trip to Karakoram in Mongolia, looking at what was happening in a certain sense on the other end, because certainly these Mongol traditions were seminal in the expansion of these trade routes through Central Asia, connecting East and West. And so looking at that as the outer analog of what's happening on an inner level, as we're always seeking to integrate and in a way to become more cosmopolitan beings in the sense of what that literally meant, which is not to be exclusively identified with one cultural complex, but actually in order to embrace and become, whether we call it citizens of the world or as it was even on the trade routes along the Silk Road, we have Marco Polo and others who were continuously expanding their sense of who and what they were, what the world could be, and then bringing back that kind of expanded vision to their homeland, which we see in Venice, for example, just the incredible beauty and richness of tradition, a lot of which was inspired by what was discovered in the East and the use of materials such as silk, the use of spices, the use of particular design elements. So I'm inspired by the idea of the caravan, as it were. And so, as you know, Tiffany Gyatso, who you interviewed already, her platform now called Caravansa, which is working with this idea, the same idea of transformative journeys. So we'll be working together. For example, we have a trip in Bhutan under her platform of Caravansa, and then other ones we've planned back in Anatolia, in Turkey, in September, October, which are always going to be for us journeys that expand our knowledge and appreciation for the arts, inner and outer and secret arts, if you will, in these places, how they connected, and then inviting others to join us on those journeys so that we're all, in a way, enriching ourselves through those connections.
Yeah, and that one with Tiffany, for example, just to give people a different sense of the kind of trips you do. Some of them, I think the ones you lead, they're a lot more like hiking. And the ones with Tiffany, you're actually spending more time in particular artist studios or things, learning the craft of how to make tankas and things like that. Isn't that correct?
That's very correct, yes.
Yeah.
So I think what we're experimenting with on this trip to Bhutan in May is an integration of those two modalities. We have the studio, which is the idea of art creation, and in this context, focusing on the iconography of the Tantric Buddhist goddess of fire, Vajrayogini, which in Vajrayana Buddhism would be considered the creation phase, where you identify with a archetypal being, in this case, the holy fire, as it were, in an anthropomorphic form, 3 eyes, all of the different intricate symbolism involved in Vajrayogini and her varying forms, on one way identifying with the energies that we all have within us, but by doing that through literally the creation of art. And then looking at how in the Tantric Buddhist tradition, that was a foundation for exploring, going from the iconography to the psycho and neuroanatomy, through the breathing practices, through the movements, and it could be through dance, it was done through breath work, and looking at how those dynamics fed each other. And so how it was that by actually doing doing, let's say, a very embodied practice of Vajrayana, certain kind of visions would arise by which artists of the past, masters of the past would actually envision and often create in artistic form, their particular vision of Vajrayana. For example, Naropa had a particular vision of Vajrayana from the side in profile, holding up her skull bowl, etc., rather than the more frontal view that had been common before that. Then there were forms that were headless forms of Vajrayana. Some of the earliest were in this idea that it was a transcendent state in which the ego was severed, and that was symbolized by the whole process of beheading, this kind of radical iconography that had a very profound and symbolic meaning. And then we see that in Tibetan Buddhist practices of Troma Nakmo, for example, where you visualize having the top of your head chopped off and you invert it and hold it upside down, and boom, you're free. And that's where you've gone beyond the hope and fear that often is invoked as the obstacles to deeper levels of intrinsic awareness. So we'll be exploring all of that. And in the same time, by going to some of these sacred shrines and places that do involve hiking and pushing the boundaries. But what we'll do on this trip, for example, is making it possible for anyone. We have somebody in their mid-80s who wants to join. And so she may not come to one of the temples that involves a 3-hour hike.
Vajrayogini hike, yeah.
Yeah, the Chumpuk hike, but we'll have other activities involved. And I think what's very exciting about this trip, as you know, I do many trips in Bhutan with Dr. Nida, who is incredibly accomplished, both as a traditional Tibetan Sorik doctor and healer, but also, of course, with the Yutok Nintik inner tantric tradition. But in this occasion, we'll be working with Tuku Tenzin Rabgye, who is a very accomplished Salung Tumo master in Bhutan, who will be teaching and introducing practices at these particular places. So tapping into the local resources, and I'll be working along with them to help frame and introduce the outer, inner, secret levels of Vajrayana. So that's the trip in May.
Wonderful. And will you be doing one before in South America?
No, the one we were going to do in South America, we just had too many other things going on. So we're postponing that probably till next year, in which case we will have a journey. I think it's going to probably be next March or April in Brazil. And that is looking again at indigenous shamanic work with medicines and its connection to Vajrayana Buddhist practices of dream yoga and bardo. This idea again of between how it is that we navigate visionary phenomena and experiences in order to bring about that illuminated condition that enriches our existence.
Sounds like we're right at the heart of the bullseye, what we're interested in on Sahaja Soma. Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I should mention in that context too about
Yeah.
Sahaja Soma that on the Silk Road, certainly I want to do a trip there, probably we'll do something with caravans there, because there was so much along the Silk Road that opened up for me about literally the Soma, the Homa, as it was called in the Zoroastrian tradition. There was Paganum Harmala, the Syrian Ru, the marketplaces, and then obviously a lot of evidence in museums there. They had the rhytons by which these concoctions were drunk and the places in which it was drunk and how that was integrated into the practices. So some of the connections I made there, how this was harvested, how it was used and integrated into traditional medicine. So connections there with traditional healers, as well as some of the more mystically inclined Sufi traditions. So we're hoping to do a kind of magic and mystery on the Silk Road through Central Asia next year as well.
That would be very cool. Also, since you go to Turkey, you're going there for the second time. I mean, there's a lot of Paganum Harmala and tradition of that in Turkey.
That's very true. And in fact, we did find in Konya, where we went, where Rumi, of course, was very active, that in the Sufi tradition there, they made a drink from Syrian Ru that they integrated in the Sema tradition.
Do you know what they were combining it with, or anything? Or were they drinking it on its own?
That, as far as I have to double check that, because we didn't experience it firsthand. We were just told about it, but it was in the context of how these kind of substances can be integrated with practice in order to bring about the results that are sought. And that can be as subtle as green tea in Zen Buddhism, which has a long history, to Paganum Harmala in Zoroastrian ritual, and of course in the Soma tradition, in the Kaula traditions of India, where it was about, in a sense, dissolving the boundaries between the divine and the human experience. Drinking Soma, we become one with the gods. So all of that, I think, speaks to, again, today's situation where there's so much richness that can come when we are able to integrate traditional practices with looking at them in their larger connection between all of these traditions developed in dialogue with other traditions, except that we tend over time to forget where they originated from. We think of Tibetan Buddhism as a preset model, but it integrated so much pre-Buddhist Bön tradition, mountain gods and prayer flags and smoke offerings from a tradition that existed long before Buddhism ever appeared in the area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We see that with different forms of Buddhism, Chinese, Japanese Buddhism, deeply syncretic.
Yeah. So I think this idea, soma syncretism, is what we're interested in. And I think that's where pilgrimage comes in, because then people experientially kind of go beyond the current horizons of their experience in order to embrace and then experience different modes of practice, different modes of being in different settings that are just innately and inherently exciting, interesting, and vivifying. So that's certainly what I hope to do with the kind of contemporary pilgrimages that we curate and invite people to join us on.
How do you prepare people? Miles talked about this, the difference between pilgrim's mindset and a tourist.
Mm-hmm.
And they are not the same thing. And we're literally actively, willingly going into discomfort instead of paying a lot of money for a trip that's very well manicured and it's all supposed to go according to plan. And sort of, I think Miles was talking about communicating those expectations clearly so
Yep.
that you're attracting the right kind of people, and that expectations are adjusted accordingly. And I'm wondering,
No, I
one,
think
how you think of that distinction, and two, how you communicate that.
Yeah, I think it's a critical point. And I think, for example, all the trips to Pamako, which were extremely challenging, I spent more time trying to dissuade people who expressed interest in coming from coming, because I recognized that if they had any hesitation, if they had any concern about vertigo or a steep trail, it's just like
Right.
it wasn't going to happen. They had to be so passionate about wanting to come that there was just no doubt. And that was for Pamako, because those were extreme expeditions, really extreme. I mean, I couldn't do half of the ones that I did back then now, I would say, just because they really pushed the limits extremely.
Right.
But the people who came on them were all aligned. And so anybody who does read my book, The Heart of the World, will see, we had the three Gillenwater brothers, we had Christian Coopers, others who that was what they wanted. They wanted to be pushed beyond, not by me, but by the circumstances. And they were ready to dive in that level. But I have had notably, and I've led like 10 trips to Mount Kailash, for example, in Tibet. But then we had one trip where I wasn't able to go at the end. And that was difficult for people because they hadn't been, I'd say, properly oriented towards the idea that anything might happen. A real pilgrimage is never going to go as planned. And the idea is that it's not supposed to go as planned, because the idea is to drop the planning mind in order to embrace whatever arises. And so this is the pilgrim's mindset, which is to embrace infinite possibility rather than feeling concerned about whether your certain material comforts are going to be ensured, if you're going to be able to take a shower every 3 days, whatever it might be. The real pilgrim's mindset is to go beyond what it is that we normally think is essential for us. Maybe you have to give up coffee. Maybe it's giving up a shower every day. It could be many different things. So for some, I think very, very important to prepare people for that. But even a traveler and a tourist have big differences. I think a tourist is somebody who wants to travel by taking all of their comforts from home, having those with them along the way. It's what the whole idea of a 4 or 5-star hotel is about, versus a traveler who is willing to forego those comforts in order to integrate with a different culture, a different way of being. And then a next step would be really the pilgrim, who is ready to step out of any expectation altogether. And that's, of course, where it's a more transformative experience. So it's something that we've learned to give more importance to in helping people to understand that anything might happen, but certain trips are going to be more challenging, obviously, than others. So we also try to accommodate people who don't want to push to that level, and always make provisions for them within the structure of the trip as a whole. If they want, for example, to forgo a 2 or 3 day part of it that might just not be what they wanted, not maybe what they needed. And that's often the case. So it's also honor. People should really honor what they want out of a trip and not feel that there's some essentiality to the itinerary. And I think that's really important too, because itineraries always have to be provisional, and we have to be adaptable, and people themselves shouldn't feel that it's something that they have to conform to. So we always want to
nice that you offer that flexibility.
I think it's important.
I can attest to that as someone who's been on your pilgrimages.
Yeah. And I think it was great. It was a really perfect decision that you made at that time.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And so that's it. Always having the freedom to change course when it may, just think, there's another possibility here, and allowing for that. And that's really the individual journey that should be preferenced, rather than some kind of collective itinerary that's going to fit everybody. So I think there always has to be individual flexibility.
And Bhutan's quite forgiving in many ways. I mean, it's quite the opposite end of the spectrum of going to India. It's really much easier in a lot of ways. Where would you place the Mongolia trip kind of on that map?
Well, that's interesting and a good question. Mongolia is, I'd say, probably somewhere in between, only in the sense that Mongolia is sort of very sparsely populated steppe land, but ranging from deserts to taiga, meaning these kind of forested areas up on the Siberian border. It can snow in the middle of July, so it can
Oh,
be.
wow.
Yeah, I've experienced that there in Mongolia. But also on the trip that we're doing, this Gates of Shambhala, there will be a period where we go to the Altai Mountains, which is considered the inner gate into this sort of legendary kingdom of Shambhala. And there we'll be staying in ger camps. So the gers is the local word for yurt. And for example, there may be a couple of those places that have solar charged showers, but there may be a couple of them that don't have that. So there will be some challenges on the trip in terms of comfort level. We'll be staying in 4-star hotels in Ulaanbaatar, et cetera. And wherever we go, we'll be staying in the best available accommodations. But that does mean in some cases staying in yurts. It may be challenging at times for vegetarians because in Mongolia,
I can imagine.
yeah, it's like vegetables are pretty limited sometimes.
Yeah.
And I mean, the standard diet of kind of fermented mare's milk and air dried lamb. I mean, it's fantastically rich and vivifying food, but it's not a paradise for vegetarians. But of course, we accommodate that and we make that happen. Yeah, whereas in India, of course, one can get anything one wants to eat and thrive as a vegetarian. So there will be, some challenges like that. We have on the Vajrapath website, there's a link to the Mongolia trip, and that also includes the frequently asked questions that people can read, and they can sort of see, well, what's to be expected. Now, it might be a couple days, for example, where internet may be more difficult. But generally on that trip, we'll be encouraging everybody to get a local SIM card so that they will have connectivity wherever they go. But that is trying to anticipate some of the challenges. And this is different from a trip in Bhutan, which, as you said, can accommodate our comfort levels to a better degree sometimes, certainly than India. And so there are advantages both ways to either way.
Well, it sounds like you got a lot of wonderful trips, Ian. Thank you so much for your time. And perhaps you can let people know where, aside from the Vajrapath website for the Mongolia trip, where else they can find info on some of these other trips.
Yeah, I'd say right now, just in general, we have the Vajrapath website, which has the Mongolia trip, which is the only trip we're going to do through Vajrapath this year. And then we have the Caravansa website, which has the trip that's coming May. Second half of May, where Tiffany's sort of taken the lead, and that's the website that she's created. It's great. So I'm very happily working with that one at the moment. And then the other trips I'm doing this year tend to be more individual, private ones that I've been asked to organize. For example, be doing a major trek in Bhutan in April up along the Tibetan border, kind of quite challenging, but that's for an individual group. And then probably a very special trek in the second half of November in Bhutan, where we're following the route that Padmasambhava is said to have taken from India, from Assam, into central Tibet in the 8th century, the Lotus Trail. So that one, because that's a very interesting trekking route, but it has never really been opened up to now. So that will be kind of by invitation only, but if people are interested, they're welcome to contact me personally. I think that's probably the best way to organize that trip, because we don't want to really make it a commercially publicized trip, because we want to keep it small but very special. And then we'll probably do another trip, as I mentioned, in end of September to Anatolia in Turkey. And we may also publicize that on Caravansa, but we haven't decided yet. We have a few people individually who prefer small groups, and a few of them already self-selected. So sometimes those are interesting trips to do rather than the somewhat larger ones that we would do through the Caravansa platform or certainly the Vajrapath platform.
Excellent. Well, we can include those links and contact info for you so people can
Sounds
reach out.
good.
Ian, thank you so much for your time. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for initiating it.
Absolutely. All right. Take care.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it or found it helpful, please consider subscribing to Sahaja Soma on YouTube, rating the Redesigning the Dharma podcast on Apple or Spotify, or sharing this episode with someone who might benefit from it. Any and every little bit helps. Also, please bear in mind that the plants and compounds mentioned on this podcast and on the Sahaja Soma platform are illegal in many countries, and even possession can carry severe criminal penalties. None of this represents medical advice or advocacy and should be construed as a recommendation to use psychedelics. There are serious legal, psychological, and physical risks. Psychedelics are not for everyone. They can exacerbate certain emotional problems, and there have been, in very rare cases, fatalities. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you on the next episode or elsewhere on the Sahaja Soma platform.